Hello and welcome back to the PAF podcast. And this week, which is week 15, I have done a little bit of a writer's workshop of sorts, and I'm gonna be laying down some steps on how to become a better writer, especially in terms of analysis and, critical thinking. So let's just go to the crux of what I think is the heart of what we strive to do as of now, right? We are fighting for precious resources like time and attention. And dividing that time and attention is super important and plays into when, where, why, and what we write about, especially considering the environments, these and overall circumstances that influence us all over and tingle our creative senses, if you want to call it that. But when we start writing, it almost seems early or less experienced writers become a lot sluggish, um, and just nonsensical with their writing, and they don't know where to go after writing a little bit. And the only cure to that is, of course, the micro-analysis you do to your own writing, and are, of course, just trying to formulate an idea in your head of what you want this to be in not in total, but what are you striving for in a short-term sense, right? And that all derives itself from diligence of your work. Due diligence is important to sort of captivating a viewer, especially diligence to detail, diligence to characters. You have to understand facets of your work that no reader will ever understand, but they'll get the gist of it, right? And depth and creativity don't have to be that intriguing, of course, especially if you're writing analysis, because when you're writing analysis and not fiction, diligence comes in the form of structure to your points, right? If you start analyzing a product at its end, and then, at the end of your writing, you analyze the beginning, that's not really a uniform type of structure, unless you're going for a non-conform uh, type of writing style, but it's just less understandable for someone who doesn't know what you're talking about, right? Structure, diction to your writing, and also just relatability to your points and arguments is of course, a major facet of how, somebody is going to be able to understand most likely you and your writing. So, creativity. How do we apply this to our writing, especially with a lot of nuances to creative individuals and then not so creative individuals? And I'm not saying that, some individuals are more gifted. I'm saying that talent is a readily apparent fact about, most humans. Some people are born with a higher, I should say, asset in their left side of the brain, I think, when it comes to their more artistic side. And that's just a genetic thing. You can't really, argue against that. But you can improve yourself, especially in how you apply that type of, stringent of your mind to your pieces of work that you create. You see, for me, what I think goes into my writing is, why am I writing this? Exactly. Because if I don't see a point to writing about this, or I don't see a point to talking about this, there is no apparent reason for me to continue. And that is why I scrap a bunch of works that I don't think fulfill that type of agenda to me. But other people operate off a sort of different idea. Some people just like to inform the viewer. I find that a lot of analytical YouTubers nowadays like to inform you on something instead of analyzing that something, and I disagree with that heavily, because it's one thing to repeat tweets or repeat, a book verbatim and then not provide any of your own thoughts on it, because that's kind of where I had the disagreement. What do you think about that work? Do you think it's, rugged? Do you think that the art style is a bit garish for what it really could have been? And it really strikes that, fear that I'll never be able to see their real points or real thoughts about it because they try to make an statement that applies to the largest audience possible instead of trying to solidify their argument applying to only a niche view or even just themselves if it coerces the viewer that to that extent that nobody relates to it and it's so unbelievably just unique that the viewer thinks, wow, I have never ever in my life heard of someone who thinks in this fashion or operates in this fashion, and that is why it's more interesting to me as a whole, right? And, you have to learn to embrace sort of what you already are good at instead of trying to improve on what you are not good at. Because, you know, I'd rather be good at, you know, two or three major techniques that I already exceed at, and then bring them to further heights, then try to stretch myself thin and try to focus on uh, you know character analysis, art analysis, sound design. It's just a little bit too much, right? You might as well just go fixate on one point and then analyze that single point to the furthest extent you could possibly go. And this is where I think a lot of writers get caught up in learning to fixate on ideas in a critical fashion because fixation is you know, I think there was this one thing I read one time where it says that like the most intelligent minds usually just stare off into space thinking about stuff that's irrelevant to what they're currently doing. And I have that, for now and then, especially during when I used to attend school in person. I used to just, stare off into space and stuff like that. And now not so much because, you're preoccupied with as many things as possible. You have the just nonstop internet. You have just complete access to anything you want, right? And, you know, that creative sort of outlet is no longer there. And I've had to just sort of improve off of that and learn to seek inspiration from other ways, right? Sometimes, you wake up from a dream and you're like, I wonder if I could put that into words and then captivate an audience that way. And then in your mind, you're sort of cogging a lot of the, ideas in your head and then solidifying them into one single idea and saying, how can I expand on this single idea? Say I had a dream about, and, it doesn't have to be a dream. It can be any outlet. You can be like, uh, sitting in the rain and be like, wow, I really want to talk about how droplets on my face feel, or you could be in the wilderness and you're like, oh, I want to talk about how the wind on my face feels, or something like that. It could be anything, right? So say I had a dream about Neon Genesis Evangelion, right, and then I was not present in it, right, but I was just watching it unfold before my very eyes, and then through that, I could talk about, wow, this is the perspective I had through this certain lens of it. And my lens is super unique and no one has ever talked about it, so therefore I would like to talk about it. And that introduction's not necessary, but that's sort of where the idea comes from in the first place, right? You're taking something you saw or were influenced by and then expanding on it in your own fashion, in your own analytical way. No, and nobody can tell you how to essentially do that and what fashion to do that. The fashion in which you execute that is completely subjective to you. There's no person in the world who can possibly copy your writing style verbatim. It's just not possible. At least I don't think it's possible. Maybe you can program a robot to do that, but I just don't think humans are capable of imitating another human just completely. It's just not possible. And so, this is where eventually you reach a point where you have to fight the boundaries of limitation. And what does this mean in the context of what I'm talking about, right? Writers are usually blocked by a multitude of things, whether it be family, their life, or, personal issues. There's just a ton of things that could happen that limit them from writing or, digging deep into issues or critically analyze something they want to, but they just don't have the time, they just don't have the dedication, they just don't have the focus. And you have to fight these boundaries, or else you're never going to become something, I don't want to say great, but you just strive to become something better than what you already are. And it doesn't have to be better in the sense that you become better at writing. You could become worse at writing, and at least that's a change. I would much rather see your trend graph go just up, down, just super down, and when you hit rock bottom, go super up instead of just flat line. That's a boring way of, writing and doesn't fluctuate anyway, and it just is boring regardless of how you might have think you've changed, right? And there are sort of foundations and sort of metaphorical limits we set for ourselves, especially in terms of like, I want to write one page today of this article that I want to write, and then tomorrow I'll write the second one. But then tomorrow you're like, oh, but there's this event in this game that I really want to grind out, so I'll just push this off to another day. And then you're like, oh, but I didn't finish that event yesterday, so I'll just spend another day to, finish the event, and then it just goes on like that. And I read this once in this book called The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. It's basically a concept called resistance that holds us back from achieving the goals that we so desire to have as writers. And it's not apparent why we try to make excuses to not write, but it is apparent that we try to create routines, and through routines, we find ourselves more effective at carrying out certain things that we do, especially the action of writing. So what I've dumbed routines down to is essentially routine equals progress, comma, application equals success. So when we establish a routine, right, and we sort of tell our brain that this is going to happen today, this is going to be carried out by you today, and you're going to effectively progress as a individual because of this routine in a small, minuscule way. There's no major association with change. It is just a routine that you carry out in order to effectively sort of train yourself to become better than you were yesterday. And then finally, uh, application equals success, where you're applying the abilities you gain over time very slowly, and then you finally reach a point where you're satisfied with this, and then you deem yourself successful in that routine, and then you move on to the next routine, and it just carries on and carries on. And my personal strategy to keep a critically thinking mind constantly uptimed is trying to explore different people and how they operate, or explore different media and how it operates. And, this can come from a lot of different outlets. I can look at world history. I'm a big history buff. I love looking at, like, you know, uh, modern wars or conflicts like the Polisario Front in West Saharan Africa, or, you know, uh, we could look at Israel, Palestine, you name it. It doesn't really matter, right? You find inspiration from a bunch of places, and through routinely analyzing stuff, you become more versed in sort of issues and sort of know where you're coming from. The audience doesn't know how to know where you're coming from, but if you know where you're coming from, you're already on the right track, because typically the audience doesn't have to understand what you're talking about, because primarily, if you understand what you're talking about and then sort of blend it into a situation where it's understandable enough to you that it could be understandable to an audience, you've already achieved basic, foundational, just style that relates to yourself. It doesn't have to be appealing to an audience, because if you can read your own writing, then that is more than enough, right? Because most people, sort of try to keep their writing to themselves, or try to improve themselves before they show it to an audience. And as long as you understand it, it's fairly fairly just competent as a individual piece. But you know, this all stems from finding a desire of any sort, right? And what this could be is like not explainable to anyone in simple terms. This can only be explainable to yourself in, all senses. Because if you think about it, right? If you really dig deep and find something that truly elicits the highest amount of standards for you, and then effectively reproduce that onto paper, or reproduce that onto canvas, or reproduce that onto a computer screen, right? You are sort of bridging the gap between yourself and the media you intend to create. And I really like that sort of combination of individuality to artistic genius. And we are all geniuses in our own right. Some of us are more gifted than others. As I said, talent is readily apparent in certain fields and just unbeatable to an extent. But some people learn to overcome that challenge and exceed beyond the talented and become essentially talentless when they realize that they've reached the peak potential of it and their talent no longer matters because, there's no one else to compete with them. But you could argue that, oh, there's always someone to compete against, but it's not like all of us reach the highest skill ceiling, right? So why do we even have to be concerned about being talentless in the first place if most of us don't even reach the peak potential of talent in the first place? So let's just talk about how desire plays into our art, essentially. If you find something like, I don't know, you're a film buff, right? You love analyzing and looking at the visual elements of film, actors, and how they, scrunch their face in certain ways. I'm not a big film guy, but I can understand people that are. I just can't get behind, analyzing live visuals compared to animated visuals because it doesn't click with me. But let's just say you're that guy, right? And your desire through the consumption of that media is to gain a better understanding about how directors correlate to the viewer in the most simplest sense. What is the director trying to convey to me? And then, sort of, through that desire to do that, it translates perfectly into your work. And that's kind of the goal, right? You want to essentially have a hidden desire you can't really explain to anyone but yourself, right? And you want to be able to put that down on a paper in the best ability you can with the current set of standards you have, right? And, you know, it's hard to explain because, it's all very conceptual. It's all very, mishmashy. No one has a distinct amount of, affinity to every product. But, what I like is to just watch and consume media and then try to put in best words I can what I got from that piece of media, not as a whole, but as a product that tried to achieve something and I thought it achieved that. Or, something along those lines. I can't really explain it, and neither can you, I bet. Uh, so let's talk about the more conceptual elements of our brains, right? Stray thoughts and how to harness them to your advantage. Because what are these little tiny ideas floating around in your mind all the time? And how do you essentially take them and bend them to your will so it looks good on paper? Well, style plays a large part into this. And if you know anything about writing style, you know that, most of it is a bunch of baloney. And although rhetoric plays a big portion of it, I don't think it's as important as, making a point as clear as possible. Because, you can include all these uh, blah metaphors, themology, or, onomatopoeia type of, stuff. I don't know. It doesn't really matter in the end because what are you talking about in the first place? Why are you talking about this? And how are you going to convey this to me in the best ability that you can without me getting confused? And so basically, you have to learn to consolidate your ideas and try to create a singular, powerful one. And then over time, through a singular piece, if you want to, you can include multiple ideas, but make sure they're consolidated, each one of them. And here, let's just give an example. Let's just say I wanted to talk about the visual style of Masaki Yuasa's catalog of shows. You have like Ping Pong, Tatami Galaxy, you have Night is Short, Walk On Girl, Devilman Crybaby, right? The stylistic elements of those shows are totally unmatched and different, but it doesn't matter because did I understand what he was talking about? And that plays into how well you understand who he is and how he conveys that message to you through the type of, you know, I guess, stage that he wants. Because all of these shows try to tell a different type of idea through different type of means as well. Night of Shore Walk On Girl is a really perky and uplifting movie about, learning to just continue living, coming of age story type of idea, right? And then you get to Tatami Galaxy and you're like, I have no clue what's going on, but I love it anyways. And that's not true for me. I understand what the show is about, but the point is that these types of shows become less about the art style surrounding it and more about the concept surrounding it because that's where the real meat of your argument comes from, right? And I'm not saying that art style should be devalued or, the whole idea he had behind the art style should be devalued. I'm just saying that they should matter less in the whole scope of things because, like, art is so visually just already appealing. Like you look at contemporary art where it's just like a bunch of dots and stuff like that, or abstract art, and you try to draw meaning from it. And the problem with that is that I can't seem to draw meaning from a bunch of dots or like just a blank red square on a white canvas. I can't draw meaning from that. And that is why the visual elements are there in his shows, right? Because they add an extra, you know, idea in my head that would have not been there if it was just a still image slideshow of him just having voice actors talk over still frames, right? It's there to tell a story, but it helps the overarching idea that he's trying to tell. And whether or not his show can tell the story without any lines of dialogue or writing at all is completely just up to him, right? But, that's why I think personally that, the ideas that they're trying to tell are more important than, sometimes the visual elements. This doesn't ring true for all shows, but most shows it rings true. And so, what he does is essentially he takes little ideas in his head and then translates that into a big theme and then also has little tree branches of, events happening throughout the movie or show that correlate to this theme over an overarching type of thing. And that's what I'm trying to convey to you is that you should essentially have always a firm thesis in your mind, right? And not something loose, because if you have something loose and interpretable, it becomes a lot more misunderstood, right? I'm not saying to have one consolidated idea just like super strict and conformed. I'm just saying like you have to find a balance between like having a super rich with detail and not enough analysis, and then too much analysis and not enough detail or context to build sort of an idea in a audience mind or your mind, because when you read it back you're like, why did I spend so much time describing this bush and not describing or trying to evoke the significance of this bush. And yeah, it's kind of up to you to figure out that balance. There's no surefire way to tell you how to do it, but you know, what I think I do best is always read my sentence. I usually just type out a whole thing and then I read it over and then make small adjustments to what I did right and then see if I like the flow of that sentence, I liked the content of that sentence, and you get really, and then after that you get really micro and you're like, did I like this word I used? Does this sound good when I say it out loud or something like that? And you don't even have to, it doesn't even have to be for, something out loud. It can just be like, does this flow well out of my mouth, not just on paper? Because, those two are vastly different, especially because, like, meanings given to words are completely subjective to the person reading them. And so when you say, like, peril, somebody could take that really lightly, or you could take that really heavily, right? So, uh, it's up to you how you want to figure that out, but that's kind of what I do. Uh, so let's wrap this up a little bit. We're nearing the end of, this, and we're heading into the following action of this argument or this mental workshop or whatever. Conditioning your mentality to fit new change. So essentially, you have to understand that your brain is not going to let these ideas flow into your head as easily as you think. You can listen to as many inspirational DVDs or podcasts you want, and you're not going to exceed any expectations. You're not going to validify your writing any further by improving it because some dude on the internet told you to. That's not going to happen. You have to understand yourself and understand your writing to an extent that certifies your new changes in your writing as your own. Because, sorta, if you take someone else's word for it and then you try to implement their style or their sort of ideas and then put it onto your paper, it's just copying. And there's nothing wrong with copying because we're all copiers, we're all hypocrites and blah blah blah, right? All of our ideas are influenced in some way. But how we make those influences our own ideas is completely up to you to determine, especially because, like, of course, you watch people and then you gain certain ideas and you're like, I really like that idea and that's exactly how I felt, but I don't want to say it exactly how they said it. But if I do say it in a different way, it'll still mean the same thing. And so I'm copying them. It's not my own idea, blah blah blah. And you have to go through that turmoil in your head like, what do I do? It just doesn't work. Get over it, right? That mental roadblock you're telling yourself is that you're a plagiarizer. You're just doing nothing with your time, especially uh, because you try to improve yourself to write in all these different new fashions, and you can't justify them. Just tell yourself once in a while that this is all right. This is an all right change, and although it doesn't seem like mine, it could be mine. And if it could be mine, it probably will be mine in the future because I'll understand it to an extent that I realize that this is an idea held by many people, or even just a few people. And I am a certified one of those people because I can defend it to the highest extent that I could, and I think that I should be a part of those people, therefore, it is my idea. And to end it here, persistence is key. Persistence to write effectively, write with enough passion to at least inspire yourself again to write, and persistence to just keep going no matter the obstacles given to you. Because the thing about writing is that you have to understand that it's not a very fulfilling medium, especially because you have to I'm sorry, I keep saying you have to, but you really do. Uh Sort of bridge the gap between your creative side and then your logical side, because logic will always combat creativity, especially because, like, we are constantly trying to justify uh like the earth is round, but then in our art, we sort of evoke that, the earth could be flat. You're just not seeing it in the way I'm seeing it. And you're just not seeing these shapes in the way I'm seeing them. And that's sort of the idea behind it. And so you have to have a persistence to understand other people's work and then a persistence to understand your own work as well. And, just take this with a grain of salt. Doesn't really mean that you'll become a great writer if you essentially harbor all of these points. But this is just a short little thing for you to, dig deep on, I guess, or not dig deep on, who cares? It's just another day in the year for you to suffer. And that is going to be it. I really appreciate you joining me on this little writer's workshop here. And that'll be it. Thanks for watching.